Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Sien de Groot. I am a PhD student at the Database of Byzantine Book Epigrams project. And on behalf of the team, I would like to thank you all for being here this afternoon in our sixth and final lecture of the first Speaking from the Margins lecture series. We have a very special guest today, but before I introduce our speaker, I would like to go through some of the practicalities of this session. First of all, I would like to remind you that this session is being recorded, so our lectures are all uploaded on the YouTube channel of the project. So if you would like to see it again, you can go and see it over there. Second, if you are okay with this, we would like to ask you to leave your camera on during the lecture. We think that it's nice for the speaker to have some friendly faces to engage with when speaking. The chat function will be disabled during the lecture, but will be switched on again after the presentation. So you will be able, of course, to ask questions either through the chat or live by unmuting yourself. So after this, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you, Dr. Georgi Parpulov, who has been a longtime friend and supporter of the database project. Dr. Parpulov's research interests are very broad, and he mainly works on Byzantine manuscripts and art history. For example, his PhD focused on a general study of Byzantine Psalters. And today, Dr. Parpulov is affiliated with the University of Birmingham, where he works with the Catena project. So just last month, he published a book on Catena Manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. And on the other hand, he also published a book on magnificent icons in Bulgaria. That sounds amazing. He is currently working on a history of Byzantine illustrated manuscripts. And my guess is that we will see some material from this study in the presentation this afternoon. Dr. Parpulov will present to us a typology of metrical paratexts. I think we are all very curious to hear more about this. So, Dr. Parpulov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sien. You will have noticed that the word in my title is typology rather than taxonomy of metrical paratexts. Even so, the topic is too broad to be handled in a single lecture. So what I propose to do is to simply go through a few select examples and try to draw some conclusions. Pretty much all of the paratexts that I'm going to show are included in the Ghent database. In those few cases when they are not, I assume that the compilers of the database would have included them if had they been aware of them. I start with a scribal colophon that is near and dear to my heart because it comes from a Greek manuscript that was copied in Bulgaria, not very far from my hometown. These colophons, the notes that scribes leave at the end of the book after they have finished copying it, are usually rather formulaic. They tell us when, by whom, for whom, and where the book was copied. This one has the peculiarity of being partly in verse. Eoto glikizeti vivluside terma, inhariti pantanactos to sens hopulago, and so on. But then after a while, the scribe sees that he can't do it and he switches to prose. Then again, he tries it. Otin parousan eschikoston sigoron vivlon, evangelistonte saronteke, and then again he gives up. So here we have a case of limited competence, I think. The scribe tried to write verse, but failed and had to give up. These are not stock phrases borrowed from somewhere else and inserted into a colophon. And I'm pretty sure of that because they do not occur elsewhere in your database. This is one of the ways in which your database can be very useful. I use this as an example to show that there is no strict dividing line between verse and prose in paratexts. And in this case, we have half verse, half prose. The text is included in your database. Another point to make is that if you look at the way in which the colophon is copied, it actually forms the shape of a double, what is known as a patriarchal cross. It would be hard for a transcription, for a printed transcription to do justice to that. So my point is that the look of things matters. And this is the reason why I'm going to start first with epigrams that accompany pictures in manuscripts. My first example are actually pictures that have been cut out of the book where they were originally found. These are fragments from a late antique, probably 5th century copy of the Iliad, which was illustrated. It is only the illustrations that we now have. Now, these are accompanied by a number of Byzantine inscriptions. From the point of view of classical philology, these are of no interest whatsoever. Von Moellendorff really said this. I'm not putting words into his mouth. Nonetheless, they are there. Their aim is to clarify what is shown in the picture. We learn that this is Priam's palace, that these are chairs, useful to know, and then these are the manly Hector, his mother Hekavi, and his wife Andromache. Now, pretty much all the, in fact, all the legends in this picture are in prose, except for this one in red here, which tells us that Iekavi legi prosectora stichon. So clearly, the scribe was aware that this is a verse, and the stichos itself is imigligitati ectoricapimene. It is probably because this is a particularly emotional phrase that it was framed in Byzantine 15 syllable verse, what is known as political verse. On the right, we have another phrase in direct speech, this time addressed to Andromache, and that is in prose. This is also in red on the right of the picture. Right. It is a bit trite, but nonetheless accurate to compare these to the speech bubbles in modern comic strips. And what the direct speech here does is that, well, it enlivens, animates the picture, and it also gets the viewer involved with what is represented, as if it is as if we're watching this performed on a stage. Now, this role of the metrical inscriptions as a means of involving the viewer with the painting is something that I'm going to look at in greater detail with the following few examples. Sometimes when the first person, especially the first person singular, is used in an epigram, this has a particularly curious effect in that it places the viewer / reader, me in this case, in the position of somebody represented in the picture. Such dedicatory images where a person is shown venerating Christ or one of the saints are not uncommon in Byzantine art in general. In this case, we've got the person depicted here speaking in his own name. Listen, pneusmaton mum meter to logo, vitona historisa sut indicona, icona is my edition, savasic trotatos kenazireos. Right, so this is a prayer in verse, in effect. But because it's in the first person, as I read it, I become the person praying in place of Sabas, who originally formulated this. Now, notice, and this is not uncommon, that the face here and the name Sabas have been erased. The name is almost completely erased. This may be because this is the place where one usually places one finger when paging through the manuscript. That would be an explanation for the fading of the name. But the erased face is not that easy to explain. And this is not a unique case. If you page through Ioannis Patarakis' excellent book on the portrait in Byzantine illuminated manuscripts, don't worry, I'm not going to do that now. But if you page through it, you will find a number of similar examples. And it seems to me that here we are dealing with a deliberate erasure rather than accidental damage. The reason for this erasure is not some sort of damnatio memoriae, because, oh, sorry, I forgot to show the translation. The reason for this erasure is not some sort of damnatio memoriae, because in that case, the name of Sabas that occurs elsewhere very prominently in the manuscript would also have been erased. But rather, I think the presence of facial features here was perceived as an obstacle to personal identification with the image. If I see somebody else in the picture, it's difficult for me to use this picture as a spiritual mirror of sorts. So this is what caused the erasure. And this, I think, shows us the extent to which viewers, especially medieval viewers, would have projected themselves into holy images such as this one. Right. On other occasions, we have the second person used. And in this case, the verse epigram is, in effect, the equivalent of a prayer in the sense of an expression of praise. I have not transcribed the verse here. Joachim aniste miter persene texisa texis ton proeonon logon. So, with the translation there. It is interesting that this example comes from a Georgian manuscript, a collection of saint scribes, which is known to have been copied in Constantinople in the year 1030. The artist, and by extension, the author of the verse inscriptions must have been also Greek. Notice that some of these inscriptions in prose are simply labeled for the figures. Indeed, the verse here also functions partly as a label because it identifies the scene which is depicted in the image. In the very same manuscript, we have other images that carry prose labels, which again identify the scene depicted. In this case, the angel announcing to the women the resurrection. This shows again that there is no strict boundary between verse and prose, in that both verse inscriptions and prose captions play the same role here, identificatory role, with relation to the image. Right, and in yet further cases, image and inscription are virtually interchangeable. What happened here in this example is that there was originally written in large ornate letters an epigram in honor of the evangelist John. This is whom we see in the sketch, and that epigram was then scraped off. You can see traces of that, and it was about to be replaced with a painted portrait of the evangelist. Both epigrams and portraits of this sort are very common in Byzantine gospel books, as you know. It is only because the artist did not finish the job and only left a preparatory sketch that we see this process of replacement, the traces of this process of replacement. Now, it is not that image and verse epigram are semantically equivalent in this case, but they are functionally equivalent in that both mark the beginning of the Gospel of John, and both have the same counterpart on the facing page. The words kata Ioannin, or indeed the name Ioannis in the title of the Gospel. With this, I leave the realm of the pictorial and move on to texts, properly speaking. Here I will try to be briefer. With texts, we can't really say that metrical paratexts function in the same way as metrical inscriptions that accompany images, because a text, unlike an image, I'm stating the obvious here, cannot be perceived all at once. So what metrical paratexts, or paratexts in general here do, it seems to me, is that they frame the text in the sense of establishing a certain set or reaffirming a certain set of expectations connected to that text. The examples are very numerous. My colleague Jacopo Marcon discussed a number of them in a previous lecture in the same series. I have chosen, pretty much at random, a manuscript from the capital of Epigrammenforschung, Vienna. And here we've got the metrical title, Psalteros exigisis acrivestati, Herminias echusa polom. This word is erased, is lost through damage, pateron. In other words, a commentary by many authors, what is known now as a catena. There is no difference between, no substantial difference between a verse title and a prose title here. You can easily imagine this paraphrased into prose. Now, titles can occur both usually occur at the beginning of a text, but can sometimes be repeated at the end. So in this sense, paratexts are mobile. It is not necessary for, not always necessary for them to be placed in the same position relative to the text. The same is true of ownership notes, such as the one that I'm showing you on the screen here in the lower margin of this manuscript. I chose this again because it has a certain curiosity value. It is written, first of all, it is in a Slavonic rather than a Greek manuscript, but the ex libris itself is in Greek. It's written in a sort of cryptography. The letters have been turned to the sides sometimes. On occasion, repeated twice like the Vita here. But what it says, I think, is Excelestato Anactos Georgio. The most pious king, George, is the king of Bulgaria. For whom the gospel book, the Slavonic gospel book that you see here was copied. It is only in the case of colophons properly speaking, which usually contain the word telos, that these need to be placed at the end of a text. Again, the examples are very numerous. I showed you one at the very beginning of my talk. This one is nice because it has a nice play of words. Theo telio to telos harin haris. Now notice the correspondence between telios and telos, and then harin for the sake of, and haris, thanks in this case. So to the perfect God, I give thanks on account of having finished the book. See, in this case, one can only paraphrase, one can't do justice with a translation. This is at the end of a Psalter in this case. Now all the examples that I showed you are essentially one-liners or distichs, but length cannot be used as a criteria, as a criterion for metrical paratexts. And the text that I'm showing you here on the screen, even though not included in your database, is just as much a metrical paratext as any of the ones that I showed you before. This is Michael Pselos's preface to the poem on the Psalter. It is essentially a didactic poem, but in this copy of it, which is the earliest one surviving, it is actually placed at the beginning of a Psalter as a preface. Now it seems that the commissioner of the book, we know his name, Sabas, thought that the Pselos's text as originally composed was too long, and he decided to cut it down to size. So here the headpiece marks, I'm pretty sure of that, the beginning of the text as it was originally copied in the manuscript. This is about 2/3 into Pselos's poem, as we know it in its entirety. Notice that, I shall come back to this, the ornamented headpiece here, there is no title properly speaking, but the ornamented headpiece functions as the equivalent of a title. I should probably tell you that this is the first quire of the manuscript and that it is complete. It contains 8 leaves, so there is little chance of text having been lost prior to that point. This is a lengthy text, I repeat, but still a metrical paratext. Now, I thought that I could use as a second example a text that I only discovered in effect last week. It is in a 13th century manuscript, but must date from much earlier. Georgiu tapinu ke amartulu Epigrama. So, is tom paranta. There is an adjective here that I can't read. Ton is the ending tomon. Ton agiopoliton. Iamvicon most probably. So an iambic epigram on the present volume of the Hagiopolites, so the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I'm sorry, I'm trying to switch to the next slide. Now, in this case, George, probably the compiler of the book, addresses his fellow citizens. This follows in the manuscript directly after a short anti-iconoclastic florilegium with patristic excerpts. And it seems that this is the tomos to which the epigram refers. So in this case, we find it placed at the end of the tomos. My point is that the text is actually very long, the verse text here. It goes on for another couple of pages in the manuscript. Nonetheless, it corresponds perfectly to your database's definition of a metrical paratext. It is an epigram on the book. Right, so length cannot be a criterion for separating some metrical paratexts from others. Right, now, in a sense, this is the equivalent of a prose preface, an epistolary preface in this case, of the kinds that we have, for example, in John of Sinai's ladder at the beginning of the book. Now, it remains to ask what the role of verse is in these paratexts. Why verse instead of prose in some cases? The question is too difficult to handle, but I should try to suggest some lines of thinking about it. This is the slide, the image that is used for advertising my talk, so you've probably seen it before. It is a prayer on behalf of an unnamed emperor. Mikiston ke alipon chronon, asking for Mikiston ke alipon chronon zois, iskin ke tatonen istamenon echron, haran metatelos tin en uranis, eonion mesek sinagason, in lavimen pantes Christiani, lamprinantes erftus aretes, prostoxan Christutu philanthropus euimon otiofto prepidoxa kratos. Now, you see that this is not verse. I consulted an expert on that point. That is not verse in the strict sense of the word, but it is certainly rhythmical. And notice that it's embedded into prose. So the preceding and the following clauses are in prose. I tried to visualize the rhythmical quality of the phrases here, which were marked by the scribe himself. Notice the acrostic in red here. With this diagram. So with red, I have marked strongly accented syllables. And also here I have colored the rhymes at the end of some of the lines. 2 full rhymes and one partial rhyme. So clearly there is a strongly expressed metrical structure to this passage here. Now let us look at the context. This is in a collection of saints' lives, somewhat similar to the Georgian manuscript that I showed you earlier on. The ending of one of these lives, which were most probably meant to be read out aloud, and then we see on the facing page the beginning of another, of the following one. Right, so it seems to me that what we observe here is the well-known habit of regulating the stresses at the end of a clause, where the distance between the 2 last stressed syllables is oftentimes, in the case of skilled writers, the same, carried on to a higher level. So here it is not the end of a clause, but the end of a larger text unit of the text of a saint's vita as a whole that is marked by this metrical passage. So what quasi-verse in this case does is that it signals the approaching end of the reading. It is, in effect, yet another colophon. And in this sense, functionally again, it is the equivalent of the miniature on the facing page. Of course, this miniature also summarizes the text, as a title would do, by showing us the most characteristic episodes from the life of the prophet Micah, in this case. But it also, and I am sure this would have occurred when a reader was paging through the text to try to find the reading for the corresponding feast day, it also shows immediately where a new text begins. So this practical function of images, of illumination in books, should not be underestimated. So, and this is what the verse here does as well, but on an audible level. The readers, the hearers, the listeners would have known that this is the end of the reading. Right. As my final example, I would like to use one of the numerous Psalter epigrams that I collected some time ago and that are now going to be re-edited with translation and commentary by Rachele Riccieri. This is probably my favorite one, if I had to choose one among the many. Telos gratis ton areton salmon telos. Kratos garafton ton filareton kratos. Typos calonde ton de tinhani typos. Kyklos triplus si ton sevasmium kyklos. Que pentaplus utos ge nin opsi kyklos. What does it say? Well, this is the end of the Psalter. There are 150 psalms, which is 3 times 50. Not much, but it sounds nice, doesn't it? This is the end of my talk as well. But before I wrap up, one more important thing remains to be said. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to have been included in this lecture series. And I owe the invitation to Ilse de Vos, who is a friend of mine. So thank you very much, Ilse. I hope that I did not disappoint. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Georgi. That was a very, very, very nice overview of metrical paratexts and some very interesting insights in how they function in the manuscripts. The floor is now open for questions. So the chat will also be enabled again. If you have questions, you can either post them in the chat or put up your digital hand, and then you can also ask your question live. I'm opening the chat now so that I can see if people are sending messages there. I see that Renate Meesters has a question. Renate, go ahead. You can. Yes.
Thank you. I hope the sound is working. If not, yes, please tell me. So yeah, first of all, thank you for your lecture. I have a small question about the erasure of the name Sabas. Mm-hmm. When I understood well, you suggested that the prayer would, that the erasure would be necessary to enable the reader to identify himself. But yes, I was wondering if it isn't the case that Byzantines are used to pray for other people, which I think is main purpose of several scribal verses. So mm-hmm. I don't know. And next to that remark, I would like to ask you how many other examples did you find? And if there are also cases where you can see that the name has been changed by another name, for example.
I can't tell you how many examples, but this is certainly not uncommon. If you look at portraits rather than generic images. Now, the thing is that this is a small manuscript, so it is not meant for public use, unlike a gospel lectionary, for example. So the prayer here is formulated in the first person. So if you read it, you're the one who prays. As the manuscript is a Psalter, as is usually the case with many of the Psalms. It's David who composed them, but the one who reads them takes, in a sense, the place of the place of David. So I think this is the explanation that seems to me most logical for the erasure here. Not the other option would be that somebody wanted to get rid of Sabas, but why? The manuscript contains a number of other images where Sabas is not portrayed, and these are in a good state of preservation. These all of them make a direct appeal to the reader / viewer of the book. I don't think the same explanation would work in the case of monumental art, say murals on church walls. But in the case of manuscripts, it does, it seems to me. Can you see the image, Renat? Am I sharing my screen?
Yes, I see the image, but
yes, yeah.
I don't know. But when you talk about the erasure, I think I'm not entirely able, but I can still see the second part of the name, I think, written.
Yes, but the name is faded, but Vas is written. So I don't know of anyone who would have changed the name to somebody else's.
Yeah, but
that's not a
wouldn't it be then? And how do you explain that the name itself is not erased entirely then?
I think that would have been too bold, because Savas is the commissioner of the manuscript. So whoever used the book after him was using somebody else's book. But defacing is definitely not uncommon. Right?
Okay, thank you.
I must have convinced you, but this is all that I have that I can say on the topic.
Thank you.
And the use of the first person here is significant. Yeah.
Thank you. Then I give the word to Professor Rhoby, who also raised his hand.
Yes, I raised my hand. Thank you. And thank you, Georgi, for this talk. You know, this is a topic which interests me a lot. I have a question concerning texts which form an image by themselves. For example, in the form of a cross. And very often they occur either at the beginning of a book or at the end of a book. So as the kind of let's say, protector of the book or guardian of the book.
Right, okay.
These texts, which are themselves images, am I right that they mainly occur or exclusively occur in manuscripts which are not illuminated? So that, let's say, the patron, he could not afford having an illuminated manuscript, but he at least wanted to have some kind of images in the manuscript. So, so the scribe was asked to create something which looks like an image, and it's just text which forms the image.
I'm not sure that this is the case, Andreas, because if you think of the Theodor Psalter, for example, there are a number of very ornate epigrams there, written in Auszeichnungs majuscule. At the same time, the book is very richly illustrated with images. So these ornate texts and pictorial imagery do not exclude each other.
Sorry, but I didn't mean texts which are written in one kind of a distinctive majuscule, but in really, let's say, in kind of ordinary script, if I can use this term. Yeah.
Right. Yes, it's conceivable that a commissioner would not have had access to a painter's services, and then would have wanted at least some sort of ornament, and then the text can function as an ornament.
Okay,
right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Christina, you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Sin. Thank you very much, Georgi. It was very fascinating. So coming back to Sabas' example again, I just wanted to add a small thing. I think that the explanation you gave is really let's say, the right one, in the sense that, you know, the usage of this first person as a sort of universal I, a sort of collective voice, was typical of the Psalms, was typical of also other personal poems in Byzantium, like Catalectic poetry, which are strictly related to the prayer of lamentation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so, since in the Dionysius manuscript, Sabas reuses the Catalectic alphabet of Uranos by employing Uranos words for himself, becoming the new ego, let's say. I think that also new readers of this manuscript could do the same with the case you showed us. So, I mean, it is, let's say, in the tradition of this very psalter itself that a Byzantine self is reused in different, from different and other selves over the centuries. So this was just to add another piece to what you were saying. Thank you so much.
Could I ask a question myself, Christina? How do you know that the passages on the following pages are taken from Uranos's poem?
Well, it is the same alphabet, I mean, is Uranos Catalectic alphabet, so you also wrote an article about it. We trust you. No, but yes. So do you think it's the contrary, that Uranos reuses?
No.
I mean, no, Uranos is before it, right? So
okay. They are not all, most, but not all of them are from Uranos. And a couple are actually not in verse. So Uranos was the principal, but not the only source. Right.
Thank you. I have received a question. Sorry, Professor Andrist, I see that you have also raised your hand, so go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for the word, but I can wait until after the question from the chat.
No, go ahead. I will ask the question from the chat afterwards. So, thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, a big thanks to Georgi for this presentation. I always love the way you mixed high competences with art history, with high competences with text and language. I have indeed two questions. One, I was very interested in this manuscript that you showed by the end from, I think it was Baltimore, 521, and where you explain, you show this double page. On the one hand, we see the epigram that closes, that fills the empty space at the end of the text. And at the other page, it begins with the pictures. You said it functions, the epigram functions for the closing of the first text as the picture for the beginning of next text, if I catch correctly your idea. And I was just curious, because if I understand well, it's a liturgical book with readings or sermons for specific days. And if the situation with the epigram closing a text and the pictures beginning the next one appears other times or regularly in the book, if there are a rhythm and habit of this in this book, or if it's just the only case.
Yes, Patrick, there are two volumes from this collection that survive. The one in Moscow actually has proper dodecasyllables at the end of some of the readings. Nikos Zaklos used that example in a recent lecture that he gave a couple of weeks ago. Right. I do not have images from the Moscow volume, but the Baltimore one, you always have not exactly the same, but always a rhythmical ending at the end of each chapter, if you will. And it seems that, I mean, this seems to show that verse is here a sort of audible signal that this is an ending. Same with the use of capital letters. In this case, the acrostic probably contains the name of the author, Michael, Patriarch. So yes, in a way, this is a punctuation sign, a major punctuation sign, showing a break.
Okay, I understand. And the other cases, there are also a picture on the next page.
Yes, but it could not be a picture. The headpiece here does the same job. It signals the beginning of a new segment. Same with the tailpiece here after the colophon.
Okay, yes, that's current, and that's current in Greek manuscripts. You have
a book is a structured whole, so it's not just one text after the other. Well, if it is a carefully produced book, and these markers establish the divisions within the volume.
Yes, of course. But they mark when there are several texts. They like to underline that's the end and to underline that's the beginning. I was just curious to know if they always do the same way through the book or not. That was the other question, in fact.
No, they will. Obviously not. I mean, here you see you've got a wavy line. Here you've got an ornamented headband.
But that's not okay. But it's not the same one. Huh? That's Clark.
Well, not everybody uses the same rhythmical ending at the end of a Saint Vita, but oftentimes there are verses at the end of a text.
Yeah, but that's what is really interesting in this one, that they have this poem and no decorative lines or other kind of things. That's what okay. But are you? And my second question will maybe answer the first one, which because are you publishing? Are you going to publish your typology or your presentation? Because I did not catch quite well the functioning of your typology, and I'm looking forward to reading it quietly.
Right. Well, these are some thoughts towards the typology rather than a complete typology of metrical paratexts. So, okay. Yes, I'm not publishing them for the moment. I was hoping at a conference that this would be followed by a lengthier discussion, but see, now online, I can only answer your questions as best I can.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have received a question through the chat from Reinhard Kullemans, who asks, Georgi, it's a double question, one for you and one for the DBBE team, actually. So the question is, are you suggesting to include the prose with rhythmic clausula, so referring to this very manuscript, into DBBE, and what is DBBE's position on this?
I'm sorry, but I did not hear which manuscript.
The Baltimore one, so the prose with rhythmic clausula paratexts, such as the one we see now on the screen.
But seeing this is not a paratext, it's part of the text proper.
Ah, it's part of the text proper. Okay, I see, yes.
Yes, but it's just that this is a borderline case that is revealing because, I mean, it's not quite a paratext, but it's close to the end of the text. It's not quite verse, but it is highly rhythmical prose. And I think that's what makes it symptomatic in a way. The end is approaching, so in this case, the writer tends toward verse as a way of signaling the approaching end. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I should ask Reinhard, not you. What is the second?
And Ilse is telling us that we do have book epigrams in rhythmical prose between quotation marks in our database. And she has sent a link in the chat for whoever is interested in this topic. Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Steve.
Go ahead.
It's out of curiosity, Georgi. It's about the Georgian manuscript, where you have these labels in Greek, but there are also other things written next to the images in an alphabet I cannot read. So right. What do we see
right.
here?
These are, yes, this is what you mean.
Yes.
Right. This is 19th century Rождество Bogomатери, so Bogorodice. So some scholar, possibly Nicodim Kondakov, who studied the manuscript, then has labeled the image in Russian. This is, as far as I can tell, 17th century, well, late Georgian script. And I imagine it says the same thing. So identifies the subject of the image. Yeah, so these are certainly not part of the original book. Incidentally, it has a long metrical colophon, which is included in your database. But it's these metrical legends to the individual images that are not.
Okay, and if you go 2 slides down, do we see the same there? Or maybe I just cannot see it because it's so small now.
Hieronofici au grabat, so the myrrh-bearing women at the tomb. This is the same hand,
Okay.
19th century. Yeah.
So much later editions, but actually doing the same thing as the original labels, more or less.
Yes, although I'm not sure why. The image is easily identifiable, so I'm not sure why one would have disfigured the manuscript with this. But anyway, I don't know who did it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I was actually wondering about this very same manuscript. Are the labels in Greek contemporary with the copy of the Georgian text? Yes.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
also, they're very carefully written. Look,
yes,
they're
exactly.
even yeah. Now,
yes.
I can't say whether it's the same person who did the inscriptions and the pictures, but it must have been a Greek painter. And these are not. Occasionally, you find instructions for the painter, but these are not instructions. They're too carefully written, and sometimes in verse. So these are clearly captions for the miniatures.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And is this the only? Are these captions the only Greek text within this Georgian manuscript?
No. There is a Greek colophon included in Andreas's book and in your database.
Okay.
It's a longish poem at the end of the book. I think it was originally at the beginning of the book, but now the leaves are out of order.
It's very interesting. Are there any other questions from the audience? No? Okay, then Georgi, I would like to thank you very much again for your presentation. Floris?
Yes, yes, I'm sorry. I cannot raise my hand virtually.
Okay.
Because I'm somehow involved with the organization, then you have less powers than other people. Thank you very much, Georgi. Since you're talking about eliminations and since you're talking about towards a typology of metrical paratexts, I wanted to pose a problem to you that we have been dealing with for several years now in our typology. You know that we have like some kind of very simple typology for our database. Like we use this roles of scribe related and then patron related and this kind of things. And then we also wanted to include a type or let's say a type, let's say a subgenre of image related epigrams. And I was always feeling that this somehow through the other categories that we were using, because I mean also image related epigrams will be connected to a patron or a scribe, or will be dedicatory, or will be rather laudatory, or perhaps rather colophon related. So I was always like a little bit hesitant to include that category. Never mind. I mean I was wondering whether you still find useful that we keep this category of book epigrams in our database next to the others, so to say. Whether you can really like say that that image-related epigrams are something completely apart from the others. It's perhaps an unsolvable question, but I wanted anyway to ask you, or I mean just to say that we're trying to deal with it.
The thing with image-related epigrams is that there's nothing manuscript-specific about them. Yeah. They survive in manuscripts in larger number, but certainly this could occur in a poem, on an icon. The same poem could occur on an icon, or in monumental paintings. The reference here is the scene with the birth of the Virgin.
Yes.
There's nothing that relates to the manuscript as such, as an object. So. And your definition of book epigram seems to be very broad. It's not a bad thing, but I mean, any definition is a bit arbitrary. So simply because these occur in a manuscript, they count as book epigrams. Fair enough. But the reference here is the image, which happens to be in a book. Could be another setting.
Yeah, I see.
Not so here, for example, because here this is specific to the text of the gospel. So this is a book epigram in the narrower sense of the
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. That's definitely. It's, by the way, definitely true that there are many poems in our database that are not book epigrams. But okay, they have a place in our database, I believe, and they should stay there. But they are, in the narrow definition, not really book epigrams. But it will be too much a pity to throw them away from our database just to honor some kind of definition. Yeah, thank you, Georgi, and thank you for the lecture. By the way, I mean, I enjoyed this very much.
Well, thank you again.
Professor Rhoby, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps one last question or one last remark. You may remember, Floris, that are also Christoffel, that I would have been in favor of calling the database not database of Byzantine book epigrams, but database of Byzantine metrical paratexts, because this would allow you to this would allow you to keep everything which is a paratext, so which meaning not belonging to the main content of the manuscript. I see that book epigram, of course, is a more fancy term, but as you just said, Floris, that there are texts in the database which are not really book epigrams, but of course you keep them and don't throw them out, because this would really be a pity, of course. Yeah, but this you won't rename the database, I know, but this is just one remark. Okay. Sorry for this.
Thank you. Julian, you.
Yes. Thank you, Georgi, for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. It was very entertaining. You mentioned in passant this big question of why inverse, and what does it mean inverse? And you mentioned this preceding actually this mixed sort of prose and poetry text. So my question is, would you say is verse is not that important in the end, and then rhythm is what it really matters? Or yeah, can you elaborate on that point? Any ideas are welcome. Thank you.
Well, verse is nicer. That is why, for example, we have metrical legends on seals. I mean, there's nothing intrinsically better about them, but it's a mark of culture, if you will. I think within a book where prose and verse alternate, it also has a delimiting role. That was my point. In this case, it's just a matter of limited competence. I mean, he tried to produce, Methodius, his name was, he tried to produce a verse colophon, but couldn't quite do it. Right. Yes, I'm sure that verse has other roles as well, but I'm trying to think of it as part of, as a means of structuring the contents of a book. For example, it may have a mnemonic function. I mean, a verse text is easier to remember than one in prose, but I don't think that plays a role here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Christina Kubina has raised her hand. Christina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi. So, Georgi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering about the very epigram that you show right now, because you said that it's a kind of a mark of limited competence. Now, the passage where the prose starts is actually the most like formulaic one. I mean, you have plenty of examples where you would say something about the loss or something like that. So I'm not sure whether this is limited competence when actually you do have a lot of models for this kind of line. I mean, maybe there might be another explanation for it than just saying, okay, he couldn't do it, whereas he could do a proper epigram or proper verses in the beginning.
Well, the scribe calls himself horicogrammates. So, but okay, that is a topos of modesty. So, right. The thing is that if you were to write the colophon, what would be easier, to write prose or verse?
Well, prose, obviously.
Right.
But the thing is, he uses prose in the case which is actually easy. So something with monachos would appear abundantly in book epigrams. He could do that. You know, he could just use some kind of phrase that he finds in other epigrams.
You see, the trouble with, it's difficult to know what was going on in the scribe's mind, but the trouble with the prose text as well is that it contains a lot of personal names and geographic names as well. These are more difficult to fit into verse. So of course it's formulaic, because this is how you write a colophon. It's a document of sorts. So you say when, for whom, by whom, and what. I think he also tells you that it's a tetraevangelium, right? So this is the sort of information that any colophon contains. So this is formulaic. But these verses do not occur elsewhere. So these are not formulae. He's trying to do it on his own, as best he can. I don't think it's a great work of literature, but it's curious.
Thanks.
Professor Rhoby?
So, yeah, may I add something to this? Yeah, I think, Georgi, I agree with you, because when I look into the material of inscriptional epigrams on objects and other surfaces, very often we have we come across very similar phenomena, which means that there is an inscription which starts in verses and then goes over to prose. And it's especially in the cases you just explained, where there are a lot of names, whereas the of professions, words which explain origin and so on. So very similar. So there is a similar phenomenon. And I also agree with you with your assumption that with all these difficult terms and words which are very long and do not really fit to the pattern of the verse, they just switch to prose, yeah, because they do not manage, I would also say, do not manage to fit this information which they would like to explain in a metrical shape. I mean, this is at least what also the material from inscriptional epigrams tells us.
Yes, my point in this case was simply that, I mean, this is not strictly speaking a metrical paratext, because it's not, most of it is not metrical. But there are metrical elements there. So that is why it is in the database, I suppose. And it's easy to think, in the case of each of these metrical paratexts, it is easy to think of a prose equivalent. Sometimes they are direct paraphrases of a prose title, for example, or of a prose preface.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I would like to thank Dr. Parpulov again for his very stimulating presentation, and everyone for being present and for the lively discussion, and also the organizers of the lecture series. And if I am not mistaken, I will now give the floor to Floris Bernard for some final words concluding this session. Thank you very much to everyone.
I basically wanted to do exactly the same as Sina. I wanted to thank the speakers in this series, thank the organizers of this series, especially also Ilse de Vos and Raquel Riccieri, who were involved with let's say, with the conception of this series. And I also would like to thank Anne-Sophie Roekhout, who has been working on the practical side of things, communication and the setting up of the Zoom meetings, etc. So she has been doing a lot of work behind the screens. And I have to thank the speakers and of course the audience for always the lively discussions. We started this as some kind of emergency measure, but I think it has grown into a very interesting regular thing, 1 hour a month, to listen about book epigrams. I think it really worked, and that's also why we intend to continue actually this online lecture series. So we are right now in the process of giving shape to a second lecture series in the autumn of this year. So starting in September. We have to finalize the calendar, but I can promise you that many interesting topics will come up again. Latin book epigrams, ancient book epigrams, metrical scholia, etc. So together with you, I'm very much looking forward to the second series this autumn, and you will definitely hear about it through the usual channels. But just to close, I want to thank all of you, also the chairs. Now that not the chair is concluding, I would like to thank the chairs as well, speakers and audience and organizers for making this possible. And I hope to see you back in September. Bye bye, everyone.